Hello, all you Hoodats. Welcome inside Black and Gold. It is July, which means the temperature is broiling right now, but it also means Saints football is that much closer with training camp getting ready to kick off at the end of the month. Steve Geller along here with Jeff Nowak, and man, oh man, I know it seems like still a good distance to get to, but pretty soon, Irvine, California will be out in much cooler temperatures watching practices.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out what exactly to pack for a 26-day trip, right? Like how I usually pack based on like, okay, I'm there for 3 days. I need like 3 pairs of underwear, 3 pairs of socks, however many days I'm there, I will pack that many of each thing. You can't do that over the course of a 26-day trip. You got to plan for laundry. So how many should it be, like a week's worth? What? And then I plan to do.
I think a week's worth is safe. Plus doing laundry, obviously. Yeah,
right. You have to do laundry at some point. The question is, how many times are you planning on doing laundry? I feel like, because like after a certain point, I don't have a bag big enough to bring all this stuff, right? But hey, yeah,
you don't want this ginormous luggage, you're hauling around with you either.
Well, normally I would err toward a carry-on.
Right. Exactly.
I just bought like a nice fancy carry-on just in general. It's a Samsonite, so I can make Dumb and Dumber jokes. But I told that to Claire, and she didn't get it. So I'm glad you laughed. I played with the clip, and she still didn't think it was funny. What's her name? Maybe it's on the bag. Anyway, but I'm gonna check a bag. Like normally, I don't check bags because
right.
And I don't think Mike Haas will mind me telling us when we went to Costa Mesa for the Saints joint practices with the Chargers, the airline lost his bag.
Right.
He had to go to the first day of practice wearing the clothes that he wore on the plane the day before because they couldn't find his bag. And that's like my nightmare of traveling. That's why I never check bags if I can avoid it. I'm not sure I can avoid it with the amount I need to bring on a 26-day trip. But this isn't going to be an entire podcast about me packing for a trip. Sorry for that digression. But this is going to be kind of a standstill podcast. I'm not talking about anything that's going on in the Saints world right now because it's just not a lot at all. If you know of anything, let me know because I have not seen a single headline that could be spun into this is actual news in the last like 2 weeks.
No, every day I wake up now. Anything on Alvin? Anything on AK? Yeah. No. Okay, never mind.
And that's generally a good thing. Like I'm not mad about it. But for this episode and the next episode, it's going to be a 2-parter. I'm going out of town on vacation, so I won't be here. So I want to get 2 episodes done before I leave. I don't think we have to lie about that. And so one thing that we saw on social media recently was kind of the Mount Rushmore of Saints. And you mentioned that, hey, we could do this for a podcast or a segment. And I didn't want to do exactly that. I always want to put like our own spin on something because otherwise it's like I'm not taking their idea. But so I kind of
not Doug Kleinman.
Not Doug Kleinman. But so the way I kind of spun it and the way I want to look at it is modern day. It's always tough to compare. Okay, this is a guy from like 2012 versus like Archie Manning. Like, oh yeah, how are we gonna make a list of the top whatever Saints doing that? So instead, I want to look at it the modern day Saints, since 2000, which gives you about 25 years to look at, which is a reasonable amount of time. And so I put together a list of kind of my top 100 Saints players of the last 24 years, dating back to the year 2000. And so what we're going to do is break down the top 30 because I feel like that's a pretty strong top 30. Once you get into the 70s, you could move people from whatever to whatever, and it's hard to even argue. But so I want to do 5 per segment. So we're going to do 15 in this episode, and then we're going to do 15 in the next episode. We're going to do 30 to 16 here, and then we're going to do 15 to 1. It's funny because 1 is obvious. Like there's no debate over 1. So some of like the 10 to 5 is probably going to be a more engaging segment to talk about than 5 to 1 even. But here we're going to talk about this. In this segment, we're going to talk about 30 to 26. And so I sent you this list. We disagree on a few, but generally speaking, this is mostly a consensus. Y'all are not going to agree. People listening are not going to agree with everything that I say. And that's okay. You can have your own list, make your own list, send it to me. I'd be interesting to see it. You can send it to me at Jeff_Nowak. I finally actually have my DMs open. So that's good to see. You can follow Steve at Steve Geller, WWL. But let's just get into it because I don't want to spend too much. We've already spent 5 minutes on the preamble. And so, again, we're going to go through our top 30 modern day Saints that's going back to 2000. There are a few guys in the early 2000s that are tough to gauge because maybe their careers started in the mid 90s. There's at least one guy we're going to talk about here early on that's in that category of like, if we were looking at their entire career, they would be higher probably, but we're not. We're only looking at from 2000 on. We're also considering anything that was done away from the Saints. So there are certain players who maybe had 3 really good seasons on the Saints, but a bulk of their career was elsewhere, and that's going to be a factor. So first things first, let's talk about some close misses. So the guy at 30, you probably could look at any of these guys. I say Darren Sproles, Max Unger, Malcolm Jenkins, Sammy Knight is one of those guys that probably would be higher if if his career didn't cross over the 2000 marker. And then John Stinchcomb, Zach Strief, Charles Grant even are probably the closest, as in like you could convince me that they are number 30 instead of the guy I'm going to say. But are there any others that you, before we go into the player that is number 30, would say is right there on that list?
A little bit further down your list too. It hurts to say, Thomas Morstead just because of the longevity he's had, but with the position playing, sorry punters, I get why you're not in the top 30 of Saints of all in the 2000s.
And you could say he is. It's just a matter of how you weigh stuff. Like how much do you weigh a Super Bowl victory? How much do you weigh, just longevity? It's all a factor. I have him at 39, right? Like he's in the top 40.
He did have that pretty big kick on ambush.
Yeah, Malcolm Jenkins is another good example of like if his whole career was played in New Orleans, he would be way high on my list. But I would say his best years were in Philadelphia. So I have him at 33. I know you said that you would probably put him higher, which is fair. He was really good. I love Malcolm Jenkins. I wish I could put him higher, but the Saints bailed on him. He won a Super Bowl in Philadelphia, came back. So that's the difference between maybe 20 and 30. But number 30, and this is a guy who, it's tough to gauge offensive linemen, but this is a guy, I have a few offensive linemen in my top for a variety of reasons. And the first one's going to be Ryan Ramczyk. It's easy to look now and say, hey, Ryan's injured. We don't know if his career is over yet. I think his career is most likely over. But when you look at, you got him with the last pick of the first round of the 2017 draft. He was part of that just monster draft class with Alvin Kamara, Marshawn Lattimore, Marcus Williams, Trey Hendrickson, even Alex Anzalone has turned out to be a really solid player from that draft.
Yeah.
He played in 16 games, 3 of his first 4 seasons. The other one was 2018. He played in 15 games. That one game he missed was for rest. He never made a Pro Bowl, oddly enough, but he was all pro 3 times, first team in 2019, second team in 2018 and 2020. The injuries kind of derailed things, but I think when you look at and say like, this guy was so consistent and so good for so long that it's really hard for me to put any of those guys behind him in front. It's just one of the issues of like, okay, what do you gauge for an offensive lineman? Sacks allowed. Even that stat is tough because it's like if the quarterback gets the ball out, is that a good play by the offensive tackle? Like it's tough. And I'm not going to throw PFF grades at you or anything like that. I just think we can all agree that Ryan Ramczyk was elite at right tackle for a long time. And I have him at number 30.
Yeah, and I know at 31 you have Max Unger, and those two I feel like it's a tough. You can do a flip flop right there. But we mentioned before starting the pod, it's so tough in grading these offensive linemen. But I agree with you totally about what you're saying with Ramczyk. That consistency, you knew what you were going to get from him when he was on the field, and obviously healthy. A guy that was not really a vocal presence, but you just knew was that leader by example and was always showing up and giving it his all. Definitely appreciate what he brought to this offense, and I'm sure missing him along this O-line right now.
Yeah, the further we get from that 2018 offensive line group, the better it feels. Like that group over the course of time has now shown to be like, man, that was a really, really good offensive line. Even Larry Warford was solid, right? You have Teron Armstead, Andres Pete, and Max Unger, like you mentioned. You talked me into moving Darren Sproles up ahead of Max Unger. So I have Darren Sproles slightly ahead of Max Unger. Okay. Like Unger is a guy that you could argue that he should be higher on this list too, but it was a situation where he wasn't here long enough and then he retired early. So I have him lower. So let's move forward. We gotta kind of run through some of these names here because we took a little while on the front end and I want to keep this to a reasonable length. So 29, another offensive lineman, Jermon Bushrod. And Jermon gets the bump. You know, that entire 2009 offensive line was really good.
Yeah.
Right. Jermon, I just kind of, he gets the bump for a few reasons, right? One is that, you know, he was on that Super Bowl team. The other is that he was a guard and he took over at left tackle when Jamal Brown went down, and they rode that to the Super Bowl. You know, he was just really good for a long time. He was only on the Saints for 5 years. He was a 2-time Pro Bowler in 2011, 2012. So, like, I just think the consistency. So you had the Super Bowl, and then you had multiple Pro Bowl seasons after that. So I'm putting him at 29. I feel good about it.
Yeah, everything you said about Jermon, I'm totally on board with. Great personality too. Great interview. And little fun fact, when the Saints went to Cleveland for that cold weather game, the equipment staff of the Saints gave me some cold weather gear, and I ended up with Bushrod's big thermal pullover. So appreciate you. Thanks, Bushrod.
There you go. All right. So now I'm going to go the next one, 28. I'm going Darren Howard. And so there's a few pass rushers in the early 2000s that are really tough for me to gauge, because, you know, it's so far removed that you kind of, you know, the recency bias is definitely working against them. But Darren Howard has the fortuitous timing of showing up in the year 2000. He was second in the Rookie of the Year voting. He had 11 sacks as a rookie, followed that up with 6, 8, 5, and then 11 again in 2004. He finished his career in Philadelphia. That's a common road for players. Right. It seems like you start in New Orleans, you get drafted in New Orleans, you go to Philadelphia. He was just a solid player for a long time. Charles Grant is in that range as well. He's right outside the top 30. But, you know, I just think Darren Howard, again, you kind of lose perspective on, you know, what it meant to be a 10-plus sack player in the early 2000s. But I just think that he was a solid player for a long time, so I'm putting him in there.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned it again with that sack factor, and man, what we wouldn't do to have a guy that was that consistent presence alongside Cam Jordan for all these years. You know, I know further down was someone like Junior Gillette, who some might scoff at, but you think about it after.
He was legit good for multiple seasons.
Exactly, and was someone that ran alongside with Cam Jordan. I would kill to have someone like Darren Howard like that right now. All around great presence, and a Saints draft pick that was here for, what was it, 6 or 7 seasons?
I have to double check that.
I think 6 seasons, 6. And then he went to Philadelphia.
Yeah. All right, moving forward, another early 2000s guy, and this one is interesting to me because he's a player that, if you included like the late 90s, would probably be in the top 10. I'm only working from 2000 on, but it was a really good stretch, and that's Leroy Glover. Now, he's an interesting guy because he got drafted in the 5th round by the Raiders. Didn't really do much. He ended up getting waived, went to the Barcelona Dragons, which, I mean, the World League of American Football, never even heard of that. He helped to lead the Dragons to the World Bowl in 97. He joined the Saints in 1997. So you're going to look at those first 3 seasons. You're going to say, man, 10 sacks in 98, 8.5 sacks in 99. But the season that gets him on here, and he was only with the Saints through 2001. But this tells you just how good that 2000 season was. He was second in the Defensive Player of the Year voting, 17 sacks, 66 tackles, 18 tackles for loss. He also recovered. He forced 3 fumbles. He recovered 1. He was all pro. He was a Pro Bowler. Next season, 8 sacks. He was a Pro Bowler again. Like, those 2 seasons, like, it's not a lot of players on this list that have made it based on, at least from my list, that have made it based on like 1 or 2 years of work.
Right.
But those 2 seasons were good enough, particularly 2000, that you look at him like, oh man, yeah, he might even be low. Like, I probably should put him a little higher than I have him, because he was that elite in that 2000 season.
Well, like you mentioned, it's hard to, since we're doing 2000s and on, it's just that one season. But man, oh man, what a season. I loved when he went into the Saints Hall of Fame telling a story about talking with head coach Mike Ditka, and he's like, Leroy Glover, Leroy. And he's like, sir, coach, my name's Leroy. And he's like, I don't give a fuck what your name is. Just go get the quarterback.
He also won Saints Man of the Year award and the Unsung Hero award. Like, he was just a really solid team guy. You'll continue, but Leroy, again, it's like, it's tough to gauge because he crossed over and we're doing this very arbitrary demarcation at 2000, but I had to start somewhere. So he's number 27. Last one of this segment. And this is one that, if I had done this list a month ago, I probably wouldn't have him here, but you kind of talked me into it. And it's Tracy Porter. He's one of the most well-known Saints players that you would say is not in the team Hall of Fame. Right. Like, you say Tracy Porter to a Saints fan, their eyes are going to light up. Right. So how do you weigh that? Right. How do you weigh he was that impactful in such a big moment in both the NFC Championship and the Super Bowl? He had the interception against Brett Favre. Brett kind of just threw it directly to him, and sure. The one in the Super Bowl was a little more impressive because he undercut that route. And took it to the house. He might have been able to, you could argue that he had a chance to put them in field goal range on that Brett Favre interception, and he didn't even need overtime. Yeah. But either way, so how do you weigh those two iconic moments on a list of the greatest Saints of all time against, okay, he was here for 4 seasons. He never had more than 60 tackles in a season. He did have 4 interceptions in that 2009 season. He had 1 each of the rest of his years with the Saints. It's not a particularly impressive tenure, but you convinced me that, like, without Tracy Porter, I don't know, does that Super Bowl happen? Right? Like, yeah, at least Super Bowl win. Obviously the Super Bowl happens, but do you win that game? Maybe not. It was still a question at that point. And I think anyone watching that game was like, oh, Peyton Manning is going to take this down and score and ruin the Saints' hopes in this moment. And Tracy turned that into an iconic moment. Like, I don't know. Like, you could say, like, Steve Gleason, if we're going by that logic, Steve Gleason should be in the top 30. So, just because he literally has a statue outside the stadium. But and
that moment, like you mentioned, obviously a reopening of the Superdome.
Yeah. But I do think you have to kind of balance, okay, statistically, he was also relevant for this team over that course of those 4 years. So I'm putting him at 26. It's probably high.
I like it, though. And I've had this discussion with a lot of people, too, about Porter not being in the team Hall of Fame. And it's like, how do you tell the story of the franchise without even mentioning Tracy Porter? I think he does deserve to be there. But man, oh man, it wasn't the most illustrious career statistically. And if you remember, too, dealt with a lot of injuries. Sean Payton, being the guy that he is, even put that China doll in his locker room to try and like poke the bear a little because he was always injured.
Yeah, he went to the Broncos in 2012, ended up on the Raiders, played for Washington, played for the Bears. He worked his way around. He's kind of just a journeyman, never did a ton, never had any fantastic seasons. But
those 2 key games, man, are so crucial.
Right. And I am getting, this list is definitely not objective, right? This list is very much based on emotion. And that's why I'm putting him there. And I feel okay about it. And I'm not putting him too high. I'm not putting him in the top 15. Right. But I do think, like, you're weighing in these kind of situations, there is no objective standard of, like, okay, statistics versus, like, we're gauging offensive linemen versus wide receivers versus quarterbacks versus safeties. You got to figure it out. And so that's where I'm going with. But all right, that's 30 through 26. So we went Ryan Ramczyk, Jermon Bushrod, Darren Howard, Leroy Glover, Tracy Porter. We're going to come back with number 25 through 21 after the break. This is Inside Black and Gold. Let me know how much you disagree with those picks, which, again, that's the tough one. That's the one on the line. So, like, there's like 12 names that are not on that list that probably could be. Whereas I feel like as we get closer to the top, we know the names that are going to be on there, and it's really just about the order that they're in. So that segment was that was one of the tougher ones for me, because that was the difference between having them on this list or leaving them off this list.
Well, I laughed initially too. I think you sent me like top 50, and then you went like to 70. And I was like, holy cow.
Well, so the way I did, and then I can mention this before we move on. So I just made a list, and every name I was adding to it, because I didn't go and like look at other people's lists and rank them in that way. My initial goal was to make sure I got everybody and order them in a way that made sense to me. And then I went back through, and because there's a lot of names that I'm not including. Like there's 90 players or 53 players on a roster every year. I can't just rank every single one. That would take months. So that's why like I went through. I wanted to go through until I felt comfortable that I had the top 30, and it took me getting to like 78 before I felt like there were no more names that I would slot any higher than 50, right? So that's why I feel strongly about the top of the list. I don't feel as strongly about the bottom of the list because I didn't spend as much time trying to decide, is he the 74th best player or the 78th best player? Right? Where do we rank Jared Cook on this list?
I know a lot of fans would be like, toss him off of it, please. But for one play, though. Yeah. Well, and that would be a fun list to put together. Like who makes the cut as the top 100? But I mean, that would be a 3-month-long podcast to try to explain. So this segment was a little long. We're going to keep the rest of them shorter, but this obviously included some description. So thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. While you're watching whatever ad they throw at you after this break, hit the subscribe button. I don't know. Go leave a review. Tell us how much you think we're stupid for, I don't know, not putting Darren Sproles in 27 and putting Tracy Porter. Anyway, we'll figure it out. But all right, we'll be right back. Who dat? This is Inside Black and Gold. Flat out. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. We are going through the top 30 modern day Saints. And, the nice thing is I don't have to go and mine that kind of 2000 to 2005 range, which I would argue is my weakest point in Saints history of this list in terms of me actually watch. Because I don't think a lot of people watch the Saints from 2000 to 2005. Let's be real. I mean, if you're a Saints fan, yes. But from a national perspective, there wasn't a ton of attention on this team. So me being not from here originally, my exposure to the Saints was mostly through, Monday Night Football and Sunday Night Football. Like I knew very much about Deuce McAllister. I knew about Aaron Brooks. I knew about Joe Horn. I remember vividly when he pulled his cell phone out, but it's just not, that's not going to be an era that appears on this list that much. So keep that in mind going forward. And so 25, this was a player that you talked me into moving up a little bit because, and you're probably right, but it's a tough player to gauge. Right. And it's going to be Mr. Taysom Hill. What position do you even like when you put him on this list? What do you call him? I guess he's a quarterback. Like I think technically he's played the most snaps at quarterback, but whatever you want to call him, it's Taysom Hill. And I mean, like it's so tough to like when you're talking about impact. So he has the luxury of being on that 2018 team. So that helps him because, and we talked about this off air, but I weigh the Super Bowl roster heavier, right? You win a Super Bowl, you get a lot more credit on this list. If you were on that 2018 roster that had the Super Bowl effectively robbed from you, I'm not going to weigh that as heavily as winning the Super Bowl, but I am going to weigh it a lot more heavily than any other era that was not on that 2018 roster. Because like, we don't know if they would have won a Super Bowl, if not for the greatest, most egregious no call of all time. So Taysom being on that list, I'll give him credit for in that range, right? Like Ryan Ramczyk, there's a handful of other players who I'm going to give a little bit more credit to because, while they don't have a Super Bowl on their resume, they probably should. So Taysom Hill, just a all around, just great team player. He really, statistically speaking, kind of came onto the scene in 2018. In his career, you're talking about a guy with 398 carries, 2,159 rushing yards, 27 rushing touchdowns. That's a big number for a guy who's not a running back. He also has 11 receiving touchdowns, and I had his passing numbers here too, and 11 passing touchdowns. Like he's doing stuff that no one does. Exactly. Right?
Like you're talking about a Jim Thorpe type impact, and there's no way you can leave him off this list. You can argue where he should be. You could argue he should be a little higher. You could argue he should be a little lower. But when you look at like where would this team have been the last couple years without Taysom, and what would the offense have looked like the last couple of years of the Drew Brees era without Taysom? Like we talk about that divisional round game against the Bucs, that's a tough one because I think that 2020 team could have won a Super Bowl if not for injuries, right? When you're talking about Mike Thomas was playing on one foot, he didn't catch a pass in that game. But one of the bigger absences that no one talks about, Taysom didn't play in that game. Taysom got a concussion against the Bears and was not available for that Bucs game. Deontay Hardy also got hurt early in that game. So I think like the Saints in hindsight were the best chance to beat the Bucs in that season, and you really never found out. That's not helping Taysom Hill's candidacy here, but I don't feel I feel pretty strongly that he should be in this top 30, and 25 is where I'm going to put him right now.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't approve of the list at all without Taysom being top 30. You mentioned all the things he does, obviously, the Swiss Army knife that everybody loves. And, man, even special teams, and not just as a return man, also in coverage units. We know he's had blocks. Just a guy that you ask Taysom to do something, he's going to be there for you. And someone that fights for every inch, goes hard every single play. I laughed one time because Taysom got tackled in front of me one year. I was on the sideline in Atlanta, and he's giggling on his way down, to the field and gets up, dusts himself off, and runs right back up there. I'm like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, and again, this is not an objective list. This is very much an emotion-driven list. And, one of the things that, even if you look beyond the stats, which the stats kind of tell the story of like, this is a guy who has had an outsized impact on this offense. Just his willingness to do everything. Like you have to appreciate the sacrifices he's made to fulfill this role. Like why aren't there other Taysom Hills in the NFL? Ask yourself that question. You think there are no athletes?
I think we say like Tim Tebow could have been the initial version of Taysom.
Right. Like you don't think that there's been other quarterbacks who were elite athletes that could have had this type of impact? Not many of them, but some. Yes, of course there are. What's the difference? Taysom maybe didn't embrace it at first.
Selfless.
But he did what was asked of him. Yeah. Right. And over time, he did embrace it, especially once it became clear that it's like, you're not going to be a quarterback. Figure it out. And so I give him all the credit in the world for that. And so like to me, that puts him, that raises him in my mind. Whether you agree with that or not from a statistical perspective, you can't take that away in terms of like he exists in the form that he does because he's willing to do it. Like he's able to do it too, but he's also willing to do it. And this says a lot about like, that's anyway, like there are a lot of people in the NFL that you could say like there's an elite player, but a questionable person, like from a,
right.
From a team morale perspective, from a culture building perspective, there's no questionable when it comes to Taysom in that regard. So that we went long on this one because he's a name that is Taysom. Like how can you not? But I don't feel questionable about it at all. Next guy on the list, and we're gonna keep it super modern. Like this is a modern day Saints list, but this is extra modern, and it's center Eric McCoy at number 24. It's just another example of like, how do you weigh a offensive lineman versus a wide receiver versus a Taysom Hill? The consistency you've gotten out of Eric, the quality you've gotten out of Eric, it's easy to forget like the Saints were in a really tough spot roster wise in 2019. They were going into this season without Max Unger, who retired suddenly. They did not prepare for this. He retired, and the team suddenly had to be like, okay, we now have old man Drew Brees and no center and no replacement. From a cap perspective, they were already kind of in that all-in mode. Where do you spend that money to go get the guy who needs to stand in front of Drew Brees and protect him? They didn't have a first-round pick. You could say, like, hey, you have a first-round pick, and in most cases, you probably wouldn't want to reach for a center. In this case, you got to go get a center, because you got to do it. And then you're like, are we going to trust a rookie to do that? And what you did was you traded up in the second round. You go get Eric McCoy, and you have not looked back since. He's been that solid from day one of his career, and it's not over, right?
Right.
Like, you could argue that he's only been in the league 5 years, so maybe I'm overvaluing that. But he just had his best year of his career. Like, he was a Pro Bowler for the first time in 2023. He should have been a Pro Bowler more. Like, he should have gotten more accolades to this point. But I just think, like, he is the anchor of that offensive line on a group that has been really sketchy over the last couple seasons. He has been the anchor of that group. And so, I mean, you could definitely argue and make a good argument that he should be lower, but I don't think that he should be outside the top 30 at any stretch. And I think 24 is a good spot for him.
No, you mentioned it too with Drew Brees. He didn't have to worry about making the calls at the line because Drew was taking care of all that. But once Drew was gone, that was something that Eric had to inherit when Jameis took under center.
Yeah, and I mean, day one, just consistent. He did almost get in a fight with Derek Carr last year. I guess you could say he did get in a fight with Derek Carr last year. But like from a
match, sure.
It's another example of like, okay, like a locker room guy.
Right.
You know, when you get in a on-field screaming match with your quarterback and you're able to spin that positively in the locker room, I think that says a lot about you as a player and as a person. And you could say like Derek gets credit for that too. Like, there could have been resentment there. I don't think that it would have behooved any quarterback in the history of time to get in a protracted argument with your offensive lineman. Like, you're gonna kind of fold there to some extent and be like, all right, well, you're right. Okay, move on. But I just think like the way Eric handled it, the way he's kind of taken over that room as a leader this year, and we'll see if that group comes together and is a solid offensive line this year. You know who I'm going to point to and say, thank that guy? It's going to be Eric. So we'll see. Either way, I don't have any questions about that. The next three are kind of are tough because they are three wide receivers, and all three of them are on the Super Bowl roster. So we can kind of talk about all three at once. And so I have 23 Devery Henderson, 22 Lance Moore, 21 Robert Meacham. Now, I have a hard time separating these guys. Statistically, they're all pretty much in the same area. They all get credit for being around for that Super Bowl, and they all get credit for kind of being the strong members of that offense for an extended period of time. So we'll go through. So Devery Henderson is the first one I have on that list. So we'll just kind of go through some stats here, right? So he was a second-round pick of the Saints. He was number 50 overall out of LSU. In his career, 245 catches, 4,377 yards, 20 receiving touchdowns. He tied Marcus Colston for the team's leader in receptions. He had 7 catches, 63 yards in the Super Bowl. Robert Meacham caught 2 passes, 6 yards. Lance Moore caught 2 passes, 21 yards. And I think he had the 2-point conversion, I want to say.
Lance.
Yes, Lance Moore did. The 2-point conversion. So all three of these guys, you know, the one that I would question the most is Robert Meacham. I think maybe I'm overvaluing Robert Meacham. I might put Robert Meacham toward the bottom of this list in terms of. I'd
probably bump Lance to the top of those guys.
Yeah, I think if I'm going to reorder this in real time, but yeah. I would probably put Robert down toward 23. Put Devery at 22 and put Lance at 21 as I'm looking at this again, and I kind of weigh the stats because Robert's stats, it feels like he was more impactful than he was over the course, or it feels like he was more impactful than the stats maybe make it out to be. He was with the Saints for 4 seasons. One of them was that Super Bowl season. That was also his best year. He had 45 catches, 722 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He had 5 touchdowns and 6 touchdowns in 2010, 2011, 45, 44, 40 catches over those years, plus 600 yards over those years. You know, he was just an effective part of the offense. But I think from a weaponized perspective of like who made a bigger impact, it would definitely be Lance and Devery. Lance Moore is in the Team Hall of Fame. I'm sorry, Devery just went to the Team Hall of Fame recently. Is Lance in there already?
Yeah, he's definitely in.
Yeah. And so Lance was here 2006 through 2013. You know, with the Saints, he had 346 catches, 4,281 yards, 38 touchdowns. It's hard to separate those three guys is my point, I think they're all in the scope of like, I put a lot of value on that Super Bowl team. I think they are all key contributors there. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm curious as to what people think on this subject, because I have a hard time separating them in that group. And that's why I kind of put them all, 23 through 21.
You kind of, we've talked a little about Tracy Porter obviously having some massive moments. And to me, Robert Meacham has one of the greatest plays in football I've ever seen when he ripped the ball out of that Miami, defender's hand after a Drew
Cameron
Brees
Moore.
pick.
I think Cameron Moore. I want to say it was Cameron Moore. Yeah, they called I mean, I don't know what everyone else calls it, but I only call it the Meach around.
Nice. I've not heard that one. Bravo.
Yeah. And Drew Brees threw an interception. Robert Meacham ripped it out, and not like, and the great part of that play is not only that he stole the ball back, he scored a touchdown. Right.
I've never seen that since. It's amazing. One
of the greatest football moments you'll ever see in terms of, Malcolm Jenkins had a similar big play. I can't remember what it was.
Was it against the Cowboys?
I can't remember the context of it, but he had a similar play. He didn't score a touchdown, but like it was like, maybe it was Roy Williams. He had basically a touchdown, and Malcolm Jenkins like chased them down, just ripped the ball away. I think that was maybe his rookie season. I think he was still playing cornerback at that point. But so that's 25 through 21. Taysom Hill, Eric McCoy, Devery Henderson, Lance Moore, Robert Meacham. How you feeling?
It's looking good. You definitely were going through some names, and it's like, brings back the memories. And then even with some guys now, like you wish you had someone like a Lance Moore on this roster, a possession kind of receiver, you could go to.
No question. Yeah. And as I go through this list, I feel like I'm undervaluing the defensive players to some extent. As I'm breaking it down in like exhaustive detail, I do feel like, you could argue Marcus Williams should be higher on this list.
But the Minnesota miss puts him hurts him a little.
When I talk about emotions driving some of my decisions on this list, that's definitely up there. And the fact that he didn't sign a second contract here, it's not necessarily his fault, but like a Jabari Greer probably should be a little higher. Kenny Vaccaro, Trey Hendrickson, it's not necessarily his fault. You got the Scots, you got Fajita and Shanley.
Hendrickson really blew up when he left, unfortunately.
Well, he had a really big year, his final year here.
Then it was like gangbusters.
Right. So we'll see, but hey, it's too late now. The list is made. But all right, that's going to wrap up that segment. We're going to come back. We're going to do 20 through 16. This is where it starts to get really, really dicey. And that's going to be the final segment for this episode. We're going to do 15 through 1 in the next episode. This is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He's Steve Geller. Stick around. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold, ranking the top 30 modern day Saints. So if you haven't been listening, what the hell? But we are going through all of the top players since the year 2000. So we have gone through the first 10 names on that list. So I'll just go through them really quick. That's Ryan Ramczyk, Jermon Bushrod, Darren Howard, Leroy Glover, Tracy Porter, Taysom Hill, Eric McCoy, Devery Henderson, Lance Moore, Robert Meacham. In this segment, we are going to do 20 through 16. And we're really getting into some heavy hitters. And there's some really intriguing names here that are tough to gauge, that are tough to kind of weigh. And so 20, I'm going with Carl Nix.
Carl.
Yeah. And it's another Super Bowl bump. Like there was a point where I had all 5 offensive linemen, all 5 of the Super Bowl offensive linemen with like Stinchcomb and Jonathan Goodwin. And I was like, I'm overvaluing the offensive or the Super Bowl here. Cause like, while those players were very, very good, are we talking about top 20 Saint not of all time, of the last quarter century? Yeah. In my opinion, Carl Nix is that guy. And I'm curious.
1,000%.
I as someone who wasn't necessarily as close to it as you were at that point, why don't you kind of give the Carl Nix pitch?
Well, to me, obviously consistent performer on that O-line that helped, protect Drew, a run game that was pretty darn good. And unfortunately, I think definitely had potential to be a Hall of Famer, if not for unfortunate injury after going to Tampa Bay. But his time in New Orleans is, glowing reviews of what he was able to do. And along that O-line, like I said, you had so many studs, and he just fit in perfectly with the group. And a fifth-round draft pick, for crying out loud.
Yes, a fifth-round draft pick. He was only with the Saints 2008 through 2011, but it was a really, really strong 2008 through 2011. He was first-team All-Pro in 2011. He was second-team All-Pro in 2010. He was a Pro Bowler both of those years. He was on the All-Rookie team in 2008. And yeah, you mentioned, it's tough. And he's one of the examples of a guy who his career in the Saints was short, but it was elite enough that I'm comfortable putting him here. That the injury you mentioned, it wasn't really an injury per se. It was like multiple staph infections.
Nasty, right?
And they were so significant that he actually had to retire early from the NFL. Like that ended his career effectively. So, I remember, if you remember earlier in this season of the podcast, even you talk about the grades, talk about like the locker room grades and how the Bucs have like the grossest locker room in the NFL. Well, I think Carl would agree. I don't know if that's what causes staph infection, but it's not a good look if you're trying to sign a free agent and one of the guys you signed like in 2014 and you're like, what happened to Carl? Wouldn't you say that was your fault? Anyway, and that's a bummer. Like it really is. He's in the Saints Hall of Fame.
Jeff, I just had to look real quick. Stats, just games. Didn't miss a game as a Saint, and then just played in 9 in Tampa Bay. Ugh.
Right. Like a guy who was, a stalwart goes to Tampa Bay and suddenly has career end because of an infection.
Nasty ass locker room.
Not mad about that at all. But anyway, Carl, I feel good about that. Number 20. The next one on this list is Jonathan Vilma for me. And I could see people arguing in either direction, maybe that he's too high or he's too low. But Jonathan Vilma's career is actually pretty remarkable when you look at it. So he was a first-round pick of the Jets. He was the number 12 overall pick of the Jets. So when you look at this list of Saints players, there's 2 former Jets linebackers on it, who I would argue are the 2 best linebackers in modern Saints history. Like, I'm not obviously you could go back earlier and find some really, really good names on there. I got a couple on the wall behind me, but between Demario Davis and Jonathan Vilma, the Jets just let these guys go. And Jonathan Vilma, in 2005, which this is not with the Saints, so it doesn't actually count, but I can't not talk about this. Jonathan Vilma had 173 tackles in 2005. That's insane. That's wild. That's an average of 10 tackles a game. He was the defensive rookie.
I'm guessing he had to have led the NFL that year.
I can't have to imagine 173 tackles. Although Brian Urlacher was in the league at that point, so it's Brian Urlacher did some otherworldly things. But anyway, that's not even it's not even fair that I'm saying this because Jonathan Vilma, we're only supposed to talk about the Saints times. But from 2008 through 2010, obviously he was on that Super Bowl team. He had 132 tackles, 110 tackles, 105 tackles. So over a 3-year stretch, he averaged about 116, 118 tackles. It's pretty good. In 2008, he had 4 tackles for loss. In 2009, he had 10 tackles for loss and 10 quarterback hits. He was a Pro Bowler in 2009 and 2010. He also had 7 sacks over that span. He had 17 passes defensed. He had 5 interceptions. He was on the Saints through 2012. He had a couple of solid seasons after that. Not great, but solid seasons. I don't think you win that Super Bowl without Jonathan Vilma.
Definitely a key piece in that machine. And obviously you're talking about stats, but even just the person, it's kind of funny. They got like you mentioned, 2 great linebackers from the Jets, and both I feel have that quality about them. When DeMario's speaking, everyone listens, and that was definitely the case. You better shut up and have to hear what JV's got to say, because it was always really damn impressive. And a guy, yeah, I enjoyed covering him thoroughly. I was when I was first, getting into the game, and he was tough. He was definitely tough.
He's also, in my opinion, one of the better broadcasters out there. I think he deserves to be a little higher on that pecking order.
Yeah, it doesn't get talked about really, right?
Because whenever I hear him on the call, he's top notch. So okay, and then like I said, there's a couple interesting names, and this is going to be a longer segment than I wanted to be, because it's hard to talk about any of these guys in like 2 minutes.
Right.
But number 18, Will Smith. Will Smith is a guy that just kind of quietly dominated for several years. He's in the team. He's in the Ring of Honor. Obviously he passed away in 2016. The shooting incident. That's not something we need to talk about. But I'm trying. It's funny. I'm trying to pull up his stats right here, but there's so many other Will Smiths that it's like I have had to put in so many qualifiers into Google because it gave me the baseball player.
Will Smith too, drafting him. Did that begin like the Saints enamored, infatuation?
The Ohio State infatuation?
Yeah.
Probably. He was the 18th overall pick in 2004. And I only bring up the I think it would be easy to look at Will Smith and say we are kind of glassy-eyed looking at him because of everything that happened, and we're overvaluing what he did as a player because of that. And I would say no. Like, he was actually, like, independent of that. You're talking about 7.5 sacks as a rookie, 8.5 in 2005, the second year. Then he had 10.5 in 2006, right? That was the NFC Championship year. 7, and he had a down stretch,
Happens.
right? Played in 16 games in 2008, only had 3 sacks. In 2009, the Super Bowl season, the year that is really going to weigh a lot in my mind when I'm talking about these rankings, 13 sacks, 14 tackles for loss, 26 QB hits. He dominated that year. In the year where everything as a Saints fan came together and you won a Super Bowl and it was magical, that was him really driving that defensive line that year. And so I give him a lot of credit for that specifically. And he's number 18. You could argue he should be higher, especially the next 2 names on this list are kind of in a rough patch of like, how do you value this versus the rest? But at 18, I have Will Smith.
No, love the pick. Will was a great presence in that locker room, amazing on the field. And yeah, those were some hard hitting dudes back then too. Like, I'm just thinking you had a locker room with Jonathan Vilma and freaking Will Smith in there. And he was more of the silent leader type. But that I felt like Will was another guy. Anytime he was willing to give you some time in the locker room, you wanted to sit down and talk to him because it was always great nuggets that he was given. And yeah, unfortunately, tragically taken away from us, but will definitely live on in black and gold history. And I have no problem with him being this high in the top 30.
Yeah, and I mean, and you talk about that defense, and it just felt like that defense. I don't know if it was particularly the most talented defense in terms of like, the secondary didn't really blow you away. Like, the talent level, I don't think was stratospheric, but the edge they played with, the attitude they played with, and obviously the couple years later you had kind of the Bounty Gate shit, all that garbage, but like that team, and this was at a time where you could, as a defense, really impact the game you could be tone setters. You can't really do that as much anymore. But at that point you could, and that team did, and that defense did. And Will Smith was probably, between Jonathan Vilma and Will Smith, I think those are probably the top 2 names that you would say like, oh yeah, these are the tone setters. And so that's why I have them higher. And, I came into the kind of talking about how like I'm probably undervaluing some defense here. Like, maybe you should have some more defensive players higher on this list, but the list is set. I carved it. You can't change it now. All right. The next 2 players in this list are tough. And I had a hard time slotting these guys in. So I put them together and I said, okay, we're going to handle this in one fell swoop. And it's going to be the last 2 of this episode. And so I have Joe Horn at number 17, and I have the guy who was throwing in passes, Aaron Brooks, at
double dip
number at number 16. And, you know, it's tough because, like, you look at Aaron Brooks and he didn't have a great career in terms of he's 38 and 52 as a starter. But this was at a time where the Saints, I would argue, were kind of starting to figure out who they wanted to be as a team, right? Joe Horn is another guy who, you know, he kind of lucked out in the sense of he started with the Saints in 2000 and his really strong career with the Saints. That's when it, like, that also kind of coincides when I am overvaluing the list. But, you know, you're talking about a guy, 94 catches in 2000, 1,340 yards, 8 touchdowns, 83 catches, 1,265, 9 touchdowns, 88 catches, 1,312 yards, 7 touchdowns, 78 catches, 973 yards, 10 touchdowns. And then in 2004, again, 94 catches, 1,399 yards, and 11 touchdowns. So over that 5-year stretch, his low watermark was 78 catches, 973 yards. And in that year, he had double-digit touchdowns. You know, just for perspective, Mike Thomas in his career has never had double-digit touchdowns, right? Like he was a massive part of that offense. And, like, again, you know, the team overall record was not great. They hovered around 500, but, you know, Aaron Brooks has 20,000 passing yards in his career. I want to say he's the second on the Saints passing list in touchdown and yardage. Let's see. I want to make sure that's right.
And obviously you bring up Joe Horn, just brought that swag factor. Obviously, we all know the infamous cell phone incident, and I think kind of changed almost celebrations instantly after that.
I think the NFL, that, like, when you talk about why the NFL kind of outlawed touchdown celebrations, he was a part of that. Now, was he the only one? No. I mean, you had Randy Moss mooning the crowd, and you had all these guys doing some crazy stuff, but that was definitely a part of it. I know he got fined pretty heavily at that point. Just to correct, okay, Aaron Brooks is third on the all-time list, 19,156 yards. Behind, obviously, Drew with 68,000 yards and Archie Manning with 21,000. So he's close. And like, was Aaron Brooks the best quarterback in Saints history? No. Am I overvaluing him on this list because he was a quarterback? Probably. But you're talking about the most important position on the field, and he kept the Saints relevant, right, for that extended period of time. And Joe Horn is a direct recipient of kind of that era. You know, it was funny. I was watching. He's just a quarterback that you kind of forgot about, right?
In the Saints Hall of Fame. When I first moved down to New Orleans, actually in 2000, he had a commercial out, and I think it was Reebok, and it was, you know, ready or not, here we come. You know, Feet Don't Fail Me Now by Parliament, and he was obviously a huge factor for this team and guided them to their first freaking playoff victory, not for first playoff appearance, but first playoff victory. So obviously worthy of the list.
And and so, you know, one of the other reasons, like, you can look at his stats, you can look at whatever. So yes, he was the quarterback architect of the first playoff victory that was in the year 2000. So it counts. He went 16-29, 266 yards, 4 touchdown passes, 1 interception. Saints won 31-28. So
Hakeem dropped the ball.
Hakeem dropped the ball. I think we have that. Do we have that in our podcast intro? I can't remember, but we have a good. That's like one of the best Jim Henderson moments that you'll find.
Yeah, you can't help but feel that emotion, right?
He struggled against the Vikings, you know, in the next round, 30-48, 295 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's tough to slot Aaron Brooks. So I just felt like it was fitting to put him next to Joe Horn. That's honestly, like, people can tell me I'm stupid and I'm wrong. I had to put him somewhere, and that just made sense to me.
Yeah, I get it. It's kind of, you know, the duo you think about together.
Yeah. So partners in crime. There you go. But that's it. So that puts us through number 16. The next episode is going to be the top 15. And we're going to dive in the next episode. So let me know. Hit us up. Send us an email. Whatever. Do people still do that? Do people send emails when they're angry?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So let us know how much you hated that list, and we will come back later in the week.
Do we have an Inside Black and Gold email?
No, we should. We should make one. Maybe that's what I'll do.
Right. There we go.
That's what I'll do this afternoon is make an Inside Black and Gold email that you can send us stuff. That's not a terrible idea. Good job, Steve.
Sending some questions, ideas, thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, that was like theoretically, that's what people could do on Twitter. That's why one of the reasons we created that Twitter account. But I feel like people are more likely to, like if you don't use Twitter, are you going to, so anyway.
Right. I got you.
But all right, let's wrap that up. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back later in the week. Talk about the top 15. Who dat? Go Saints. Easy, yo.
Let's go Black and Gold.